Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when a mind meant to rule is imprisoned in a body meant to serve? What occurs when the very system designed to crush a spirit inadvertently hands it the keys to its own destruction? Tonight, I need to tell you something that few history books dare to mention. A story buried beneath centuries of silence, hidden in the crumbling archives of Stone Town, whispered only among those who remember what the Indian Ocean waves carried away. In the year 1804, on an island where cloves perfumed the air and human flesh was sold cheaper than ivory, a boy with no name worth recording in official documents discovered something his masters never intended him to find. He learned to read their secrets. Not just their language, their codes, their hidden communications, the encrypted messages that moved ships, gold, and lives across 3 continents. And what he did with that knowledge, well, that changed everything. If you want to uncover the truth behind one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance in African history, stay with me. Like this video now, because what I am about to reveal has never been told quite like this before. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that some stories deserve to be heard, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel. What this boy accomplished will fundamentally shift how you understand power, resistance, and the terrible cost of underestimating those you oppress. His name was Baraka. And this is the night the Sultan's palace burned not from fire, but from the inside. The ruins still stand on the eastern edge of Stone Town, though most tourists walk past them without a second glance. Coral stone walls, bleached by 2 centuries of salt air, rise like broken teeth against the Zanzibar sky. The afternoon call to prayer echoes across the narrow streets, bouncing off the same surfaces that once absorbed screams no one was permitted to hear. If you press your palm against these walls during the hottest hours, locals say you can still feel something pulsing beneath the surface. Not heat from the sun, something older, something that remembers. The old fishermen who mend their nets near the harbor speak of certain nights when the wind carries voices in a language no one has spoken in generations. Swahili mixed with something else, clicking sounds, tonal shifts, a coded speech that died with the last of those who created it. They cross themselves, these Muslim fishermen, making gestures their grandmothers taught them, protections against memories too heavy to name. The building that once housed the most powerful slave trading operation in East Africa now shelters nothing but pigeons and the occasional archaeology student mapping what remains. But in 1804, this coral fortress processed more human cargo than any other structure on the African coast. Men, women, and children arrived by the thousands from the interior, from the Great Lakes, from the forests of the Congo, from lands so far inland that the ocean itself seemed like a myth until they saw it. What the official histories record is this: Zanzibar served as the central hub for the Arab slave trade, a network that predated European involvement by centuries and would outlast it by decades. What those histories fail to mention is the boy who dismantled it from within, using nothing but the gift his oppressors gave him, without understanding what they were doing. The central thesis of this account rests on a single, uncomfortable truth: that the systems built to dehumanize often produce the very instruments of their own destruction. Baraka was not supposed to exist as a thinking being. He was supposed to exist as property, useful, compliant, forgettable. The fact that he became something else entirely reveals more about the nature of oppression than any academic treatise ever could. If you want to follow more investigations like this one, cases that expose what power tries to hide, subscribe to this channel right now. You need to see what comes next. The Sultan's palace in 1804 occupied a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings near the harbor. 47 rooms spread across 3 levels, each one designated for a specific function in the machinery of commerce and control. The ground floor housed the counting rooms where clerks tallied profits in 3 currencies: the Maria Theresa thaler preferred by Arab merchants, the Indian rupee used by Gujarati traders, and the Spanish dollar that European powers demanded for certain transactions. The second floor contained the administrative offices where routes were planned, bribes were calculated, and human beings were reduced to units of trade. The third floor belonged to the Sultan himself and his most trusted advisors, the inner sanctum, where decisions affecting hundreds of thousands of lives were made over cups of cardamom-spiced coffee. The architecture itself spoke of power designed to intimidate. Carved wooden doors from Persia, some weighing over 800 pounds, marked the entrances to important chambers. Brass studs covered these doors in patterns that served both decorative and defensive purposes, remnants of an era when elephants were used as battering rams in siege warfare. The ceilings stretched 15 feet high in the public areas, designed to make visitors feel small, while the private quarters maintained more human proportions. The hierarchy within these walls followed patterns as rigid as the architecture itself. At the apex sat Sultan Said, whose dominion extended from the Zanzibar coast deep into the African interior, through a network of trading posts, military garrisons, and local alliances maintained through a careful balance of violence and reward. Below him, the merchant class, Arabs from Oman and Yemen, Indians from Gujarat and Kutch, and a handful of Swahili traders who had accumulated enough wealth to purchase proximity to power. Below them, the administrators, literate men who kept the records, drafted the correspondence, and managed the logistics of an empire built on human suffering. And beneath everyone, invisible except when needed, moved the enslaved. Domestic servants, porters, craftsmen, translators. Bodies without legal standing, without recognized names, without the right to exist outside their designated functions. The palace employed 17 domestic slaves in positions that required proximity to sensitive information. These were not field workers or dock laborers. They were trusted, insofar as property could be trusted, with access to private spaces. They served food during negotiations. They cleaned rooms where documents lay on tables. They stood in corners, silent and presumably deaf, while their masters discussed matters of state and commerce. This trust was predicated on a single assumption, that the enslaved were incapable of understanding what they observed, that their presence in rooms of power was as inconsequential as the presence of furniture, that the elaborate code system used for sensitive communications, a cipher developed over 3 generations and known only to the Sultan's inner circle, was completely secure from comprehension by those whose labor sustained the entire operation. The assumption proved catastrophic. The sounds of that world have been reconstructed from contemporary accounts. The constant slap of waves against the harbor wall, the calls of merchants hawking wares in 6 languages, the clink of chains from the nearby slave market, the muezzin's voice rising 5 times daily to remind the faithful of obligations that apparently did not extend to those they owned. Beneath these sounds, always, the undertone of human misery, weeping that had learned to be quiet, screams that were quickly silenced, the shuffle of feet belonging to people who had surrendered hope of ever walking freely again. Into this world came a boy who would refuse to surrender anything. The boy who would become known as Baraka, a name meaning blessing in Swahili, though whether this was given in sincerity or irony remains debated by the few scholars who have examined his case, arrived at the Stone Town slave market in the spring of 1798. He was approximately 8 years old, though no one recorded his exact age. He came from somewhere near Lake Tanganyika, a journey of over 800 miles on foot, during which nearly half his original caravan perished from exhaustion, disease, or the casual violence that punctuated such marches like grammar marks in a long and terrible sentence. His original name died with those who had given it to him. His parents had been killed during the raid on his village, his father immediately resisting the attackers, his mother 3 days into the march when she could no longer maintain the pace required and was deemed not valuable enough to slow the caravan. The boy had watched both deaths. He had not been permitted to grieve either one. What made Baraka unusual was apparent from the first week of his captivity. The boy possessed a mind that absorbed information the way coral absorbs calcium from seawater, constantly, efficiently, without apparent effort. He learned Swahili within months, mastering not just the basic vocabulary, but the complex grammatical structures that most foreigners never fully acquired. He observed patterns that others missed. He remembered conversations verbatim, reproducing them days later with accuracy that unsettled even the slavers who recognized its potential value. The merchant who purchased him, an Omani Arab named Hamad bin Juma, recognized immediately that this particular acquisition fell outside normal categories. The boy was too intelligent for field labor, where such capacity would be wasted, too young for the skilled trades that required years of apprenticeship, too foreign for positions requiring established loyalty. Hamad made a decision that would later cost him everything. He would educate the boy, not extensively, not in ways that might create competition, but sufficiently to make him useful in capacities that required literacy. Baraka would learn to read and write Arabic. He would learn basic mathematics. He would be trained as a household servant with enough education to assist with record-keeping and correspondence. The reasoning seemed sound from the merchant's perspective. A literate slave was worth more than an illiterate one. A slave who could help manage household accounts saved money on hired scribes. The risk appeared minimal. After all, what could a boy do with such knowledge except make himself more valuable to his owner? Hamad bin Juma's household occupied a 3-story coral stone building in the merchant quarter of Stone Town. The ground floor served as warehouse space for goods awaiting sale or shipment. The second floor contained the family's living quarters. The top floor housed a small office where Hamad conducted his more delicate business transactions, those involving sums large enough to attract unwanted attention if discussed in public spaces. Baraka's duties initially focused on the domestic, fetching water from the cistern, preparing the hookah pipes that Hamad favored in the evenings, running messages to other merchants' households. These tasks were deliberately menial, designed to establish the boy's position in the hierarchy before any elevation could occur. For 6 months, Baraka performed them without complaint or variation, learning the household's rhythms, mapping its relationships, identifying where power actually resided versus where it appeared to reside. His education began in the 7th month, conducted by an elderly clerk named Yusuf, who had served Hamad's family for 3 decades. Yusuf was not unkind, a rarity in that environment, but neither was he under any illusion about what he was doing. He was training a tool. The fact that the tool happened to be a human child was irrelevant to the transaction. The lessons took place in the early morning, before the household fully awakened, in a small room adjacent to the rooftop terrace. Yusuf began with the Arabic alphabet, expecting the slow progress typical of young students. What he encountered instead was something he would later describe, under interrogation, as unnatural, though he never clarified whether he meant the word as condemnation or wonder. Baraka learned the alphabet in 4 days. Within 2 weeks, he was reading simple texts with minimal assistance. Within 2 months, he was composing basic correspondence that Yusuf had to check only for formal conventions, rather than errors of language. The old clerk had taught dozens of students over his long career. None had progressed with anything approaching this speed. What Yusuf did not know, could not have known, was that Baraka was learning far more than he revealed. The boy had discovered that literacy, once acquired, could not be easily constrained. The same skills that allowed him to read approved texts also allowed him to read documents left carelessly on Hamad's desk. The same memory that retained lesson content also retained overheard conversations, observed transactions, patterns of behavior that revealed the true nature of the business that supported his owner's comfortable existence. The first indication of what Baraka was actually doing with his education came 3 years into his service, when Hamad discovered the boy had taught himself to read not only Arabic, but also the simplified Gujarati script used by the Indian merchants who dominated much of Zanzibar's trade. No one had instructed him. No one had even known he had access to materials in that language. He had simply observed, absorbed, and learned, as he was learning everything else that passed before his unnaturally attentive eyes. Hamad was simultaneously impressed and disturbed by this discovery. The initiative suggested value. A slave who could communicate in multiple languages was worth considerably more than a monolingual one. But it also suggested something else, something harder to name. A capacity for independent action that sat uneasily with the assumptions underlying the entire system of bondage. The merchant chose to interpret the discovery positively. Baraka was clearly exceptional, and exceptional property reflected well on its owner. Word of the multilingual slave boy spread through Stone Town's trading community, enhancing Hamad's reputation as a man who recognized and cultivated talent wherever it might be found. This reputation would lead directly to Baraka's transfer to the palace, and that transfer would lead directly to everything that followed. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed throughout history. By 1802, Baraka had been transferred from Hamad's household to the palace itself, a move that appeared to be a significant promotion in the brutal hierarchy of bondage. The Sultan's household required servants with particular qualities: absolute discretion, minimal personal history, demonstrated competence in tasks requiring literacy. Baraka met all these criteria. More importantly, he had been in Zanzibar long enough to have lost whatever connections to his homeland might have made him a flight risk, yet not so long that he had developed the local relationships that sometimes enabled enslaved persons to create unofficial networks of communication and resistance. The transfer was arranged through intermediaries who specialized in such transactions. Hamad received compensation significantly exceeding his original purchase price, a profitable return on his investment in the boy's education. The Sultan's household administrator received a servant whose capabilities had been vouched for by respected members of the merchant community. Baraka himself received nothing except a change of masters and a new set of walls within which to be invisible. His official duties were mundane, serving refreshments during meetings, organizing documents that were no longer confidential, running messages between offices in the palace complex. Unofficial duties were understood without being stated. Keep eyes downcast, keep ears closed, keep mouth sealed. Exist as a function, not as a person. The transition between worlds fascinated those who later studied Baraka's trajectory. During morning prayers, he knelt in the back rows with other household slaves, performing rituals he had been forced to adopt but never internalized. During afternoon hours, he passed through chambers where the Sultan's highest officials conducted business that affected the lives of millions across 3 continents. During evenings, he slept in a closet-sized room on the ground floor, no larger than 6 feet by 4 feet, dreaming in languages his masters did not know he understood. The palace operated according to rhythms dictated by commerce, religion, and the Sultan's personal preferences. Dawn brought the first prayer and the first business of the day, reviewing overnight arrivals, assessing cargo manifests, addressing urgent correspondence. Mid-morning saw the major transactions, negotiations with merchant delegations, audiences with representatives from the interior chieftains, discussions with European commercial agents seeking favorable terms. Afternoon brought the second wave of prayer and the detailed administrative work, record-keeping, route planning, the endless paperwork that supported an operation of this scale. Evening brought entertainment for those who could afford it, and exhaustion for those who served them. Within this structure, Baraka moved like water through sand, present everywhere, absorbed by nothing, leaving no trace of his passage. He learned which officials preferred their coffee bitter, and which demanded excessive sugar. He learned which doors could be opened without announcement, and which required formal protocols. He learned where conversations could be overheard, and where acoustic design made eavesdropping impossible. And he learned about the code. What no one recognized was that Baraka had identified the cipher system within his first month at the palace. The patterns were not immediately obvious, they were designed not to be. But to a mind accustomed to finding order in chaos, accustomed to surviving by observing what others overlooked, the structure gradually revealed itself. The Sultan's cipher was relatively sophisticated for its time. It employed a combination of substitution and transposition, with key words that shifted according to lunar calendar dates. Sensitive communications between Zanzibar and trading posts on the mainland were encrypted using this system. Ship manifests that recorded human cargo, bribe payments to officials who looked the other way, route information that determined which villages would be raided next, the names of European officials who could be bought and at what price. All of this moved through the code. The cipher had been developed by the Sultan's grandfather, refined by his father, and maintained in its current form for over 30 years. It was the backbone of secure communication for the entire East African slave trade network. Only 11 people in the world were authorized to read and write in this code: the Sultan himself, his 3 most senior advisors, 4 trading post commanders on the mainland, and 3 trusted agents in Oman who coordinated with Arabian markets. Baraka would become the 12th. His method was patient, meticulous, invisible. He could not take notes. That would have been suicidal. So he trained his already exceptional memory to retain encrypted passages verbatim until he could work through them during his few hours of solitary confinement each night. He identified patterns by comparing multiple messages, noting which symbol combinations appeared frequently, which position seemed fixed, which elements varied according to date. The breakthrough came when he realized that the system used Quranic verses as key texts, a common practice in Arabic cryptography of the period. Once he identified which verses were being used, the substitution portion of the cipher became readable. The transposition element took longer, but eventually yielded to systematic analysis. By the spring of 1803, Baraka could read the Sultan's most confidential correspondence, faster than some of the officials authorized to do so. He knew the bribes paid to Portuguese colonial administrators. He knew which British naval officers provided advance warning of patrol schedules. He knew the names of chieftains in the interior who were secretly collaborating with the trade, and the names of those who were resisting and therefore marked for destruction. He knew the projected profits for the coming year, and the percentage that would go to each participant in the network. He knew everything. And he told no one. The years between 1798 and 1804 marked the apogee of Zanzibar's involvement in the East African slave trade. Ships arrived from Arabia, from India, from the Persian Gulf, from as far as Indonesia and the Philippines. They departed carrying human cargo to destinations across the Indian Ocean world. The stone market near the harbor, now a tourist attraction where guides recite sanitized histories for visitors who want to feel something without feeling too much, processed between 40 and 50,000 enslaved persons annually during this period. The logistics of this operation were staggering. Each captive required processing, inspection for disease and defects, classification by age and strength and potential use, assignment of value based on market conditions at likely destinations. Each transaction required documentation, bills of sale, transport manifests, customs declarations for ports that maintained the fiction of regulation. Each shipment required coordination, vessel availability, crew assignments, route planning to avoid both natural hazards and the increasing presence of European anti-slavery patrols. The human cost behind these logistics rarely appeared in the records. Numbers were noted: so many units loaded, so many units lost in transit, so many units delivered. But the individuals those numbers represented remained invisible. A woman who died in childbirth in the holding pens became a spoilage loss. A man who threw himself overboard rather than endure another day in chains became an inventory adjustment. Children separated from parents, families scattered across continents, entire peoples erased from the lands of their ancestors. All of this reduced to accounting entries and ledgers that prioritized profit above everything else. The brutality of this system operated on scales both massive and intimate. There was the macro horror, the caravans from the interior that lost half their captives before reaching the coast. The ships packed so tightly that death rates exceeded 30% on longer voyages. The systematic destruction of families and communities across a swath of Africa, reaching from Mozambique to Sudan. But there was also the micro horror, the daily humiliations that reminded the enslaved of their status, the casual violence that maintained order through fear, the sexual exploitation that was rarely discussed but universally understood. These intimate atrocities accumulated in the bodies and minds of those who endured them, creating reservoirs of rage that the system's architects never bothered to measure. Baraka witnessed all of this. His position in the palace placed him at the intersection of policy and practice. He saw the documents that authorized mass deportations from specific regions. He served coffee to men who joked about their latest acquisitions, as if discussing livestock. He cleaned rooms where negotiations determined whether villages would be raided or spared, based purely on their economic value. One incident crystallized everything. He watched a girl his own age, purchased for the private quarters of a visiting merchant from Muscat, dragged screaming through the corridor outside his closet room. Her resistance was treated as entertainment by the guards escorting her, who made wagers about how long her spirit would last. Baraka heard what happened next through walls too thin to muffle such sounds. He heard it continue for hours. He heard silence replace screaming as something essential broke. He saw her again the following morning, face expressionless, moving through her duties as if the night had never occurred. She did not speak again during the 3 weeks she remained in the palace. When she was shipped to Muscat with a cargo of ivory and cloves, no one recorded her name or her ultimate fate. She was 13 years old. He witnessed the punishment of an elderly man named Salim, who had served in the palace kitchens for over 20 years. Salim's offense was spilling hot tea on documents belonging to a minor official, an accident caused by tremors in hands worn out from decades of labor. The whipping was conducted in the courtyard where all staff could observe and learn. 40 lashes, administered slowly with pauses to allow the pain to fully register before the next stroke fell. Salim lost consciousness after 32. He was revived with water, and the remaining 8 were delivered. The official whose documents had been damaged watched with the detached interest of someone observing an insect being crushed beneath a heel. Salim died 2 days later from infection. His body was disposed of with the kitchen waste, and his position was filled before sunset. He observed the auction where a mother was separated from her 3 children, sold to 3 different buyers who happened to place their bids in sequence, as if the family were a collection to be divided rather than a single entity bound by blood and love. The mother's screaming echoed through the market square for hours. The buyers complained about the noise disrupting their negotiations. A guard silenced her with a blow that knocked out several teeth and left her jaw hanging at an angle that would never heal correctly. The children were loaded onto separate dhows before nightfall, bound for Persia, Arabia, and India respectively. They would never see each other again. Each observation lodged itself in Baraka's memory like a splinter working its way toward the heart. He did not forget. He was not designed to forget. The same cognitive gift that allowed him to decode the Sultan's cipher also forced him to retain every detail of every atrocity he witnessed with crystalline, unforgiving clarity. Other enslaved people found ways to survive by forgetting, by numbing, by convincing themselves that their condition was natural or deserved or temporary. Baraka could not access these mercies. His mind preserved everything, played it back in quiet moments, constructed patterns from accumulated horrors that pointed toward conclusions he could not escape. The system was not broken. The system was working exactly as designed, and as long as that system continued, the horrors would continue. There was no appeal, no reform, no gradual improvement possible within the logic of the operation. The only solution was disruption so complete that the logic itself would collapse. The specific atrocity that transformed observation into action occurred on the night of August 17, 1803. Baraka had been in the palace for 18 months. He had decoded hundreds of messages. He had mapped the operation's structure with precision that would have impressed the officials responsible for its administration. He had watched and learned and remembered, but he had not yet acted. That night, a caravan arrived from the interior carrying 247 captives, survivors of a larger group that had numbered over 400 when the march began 6 weeks earlier. Among the survivors were 11 people from a village located less than 30 miles from Baraka's birthplace, the first direct connection to his homeland he had encountered since his capture 7 years before. One of these 11 was an old woman named Mariamu, who recognized Baraka despite the years and changes he had undergone. She had known his mother. She had been present at his birth. She had stories about his family, his village, his people, all the context that had been stripped away when the slavers came. The recognition was brief and dangerous. They had perhaps 3 minutes of conversation, conducted in whispers, while Baraka pretended to perform duties near the holding area. In those 3 minutes, Mariamu gave him what she could: names of family members who had survived the raid, fragments of news about his homeland, a connection to everything he had been forced to abandon. She also gave him something else. Mariamu had observed things during the long march, as old women with nothing left to lose often do. She had seen the patterns of the caravan, which guards were cruel for pleasure versus those merely performing duties, which captives might be reliable if opportunity arose, which points in the journey offered vulnerability for those with courage to exploit it. More importantly, she had heard things. The caravan leaders, assuming that an elderly woman barely alive after weeks of forced march posed no threat, had discussed matters they should have kept private. She had heard them mention Baraka's palace specifically. She had heard them reference the coded communications by name. She had heard enough to understand that this 15-year-old boy, whom she remembered as an infant nursing at his mother's breast, was positioned at the center of something vast. "The crocodile does not survive because it is strongest," Mariamu whispered, using a proverb from their homeland. "It survives because it waits. You have been waiting. The time for waiting ends." Baraka never saw Mariamu again. She was sold the following morning to a merchant bound for the Arabian Peninsula. She would die on the voyage, one of 37 who succumbed to a dysentery outbreak that swept through the ship's hold. But her words remained. That night in his closet room, Baraka made his decision. The waiting was over. Whatever came next, he would act. The transformation occurred gradually enough that no one noticed. Baraka remained the perfect servant, deferential, efficient, invisible when required and present when needed. His eyes stayed appropriately downcast. His voice maintained the careful neutrality expected of property speaking to persons. Nothing in his external behavior suggested that his internal landscape had fundamentally shifted. But inside, something had changed irrevocably. The accumulated weight of years, the losses, the horrors, the enforced silence, the pretended ignorance, had compressed into something diamond hard and waiting for release. Mariamu's words had been the final pressure. The crystal was formed. Now came the cutting. Later accounts, pieced together from interrogations, from witness statements, from documents discovered decades afterward in European archives that had somehow preserved what Zanzibar had tried to destroy, suggest that Baraka began systematic planning in late August 1803. The initial concept was simple: gather information, find allies, wait for opportunity. The execution would prove far more elaborate. The first phase involved mapping. Not physical mapping, though Baraka had memorized the palace layout within days of his arrival. This was informational mapping. He needed to understand the complete structure of the operation. Who reported to whom? Which officials controlled which resources? Where the vulnerabilities lay? How decisions moved from conception to implementation? His access to encrypted communications proved invaluable. Through decoded messages, he learned that the Sultan's authority, though seemingly absolute, depended on a complex web of agreements with mainland chieftains, European naval powers, and merchant consortiums, whose interests did not always align. He learned which relationships were stable and which were strained to breaking point by competing priorities. He learned where the money actually went, and how much of it disappeared into private coffers before reaching its official destinations. The system had weaknesses that its administrators could not see because they were too embedded within it. Baraka, standing outside by definition if not by choice, could observe these weaknesses with clarity that would have been impossible for anyone invested in the system's continuation. The second phase involved cultivation. Baraka began identifying other enslaved persons within the palace who might prove reliable for resistance rather than betrayal. This required extraordinary caution. Betrayal was always possible. The system rewarded informants with marginally better treatment, and some bondspersons had internalized their captivity so completely that they identified more with their masters than with their fellow enslaved. One wrong approach would mean exposure, torture, death. His method was indirect. He observed before approaching, sometimes for months. He noted who displayed signs of suppressed rage, the barely controlled tension in muscles when orders were given, the flicker of hatred quickly masked when masters looked away. He noted who maintained connections to others despite the system's efforts to atomize the enslaved into isolated, controllable units. He noted who still dreamed, still planned, still believed that their current condition was neither permanent nor deserved. Over 18 months, Baraka developed a network of 7 individuals: 3 domestic servants who had access to different areas of the palace, 2 dock workers who could move between the harbor and the complex without attracting suspicion, 1 cook who controlled what the guards consumed, and 1 elderly woman named Zubaydah who maintained the palace gardens and was considered too old and too simple to pose any threat. Zubaydah proved the most valuable. Her apparent simplicity was a mask, carefully cultivated over 40 years of bondage, that concealed a mind as sharp as any in the Sultan's council. She had survived 7 masters, 3 uprisings, and an epidemic that had killed half the enslaved population of Stone Town. She had done so by becoming invisible in a way that even Baraka admired, not just unremarkable but literally unseen, moving through spaces as if she occupied no volume, registered no presence. Each recruit was vetted through months of subtle observation before the first cautious contact. Each had personal reasons for hatred that Baraka identified and understood without needing to ask. Each was given only the information necessary for their specific role, compartmentalization that would protect the network if any individual was captured and questioned. The third phase required patience, the hardest discipline for someone burning with purpose. Baraka knew that successful resistance required not just planning but timing. Moving too early meant failure. Moving too late risked discovery. The optimal moment would present itself, and he needed to be ready when it arrived. That moment came in the form of a letter from the Imam of Oman, delivered to the palace on January 3, 1804. The letter's contents were unremarkable on the surface. Diplomatic correspondence regarding trade agreements, naval cooperation against increasing European encroachment in the Indian Ocean, routine matters of state between Allied powers. But the encryption used was the highest level, the code reserved for communications affecting the Sultanate's survival. And what it actually conveyed was far more significant. The Imam was dying. His physicians had given him months at most. His designated successor was weak and disputatious, surrounded by rivals who smelled opportunity in the coming transition. Factions within the Omani court were already maneuvering for advantage, forming alliances, positioning forces. Civil conflict upon succession was not just possible but probable. The Sultan of Zanzibar was being invited to prepare for possible intervention, which meant amassing resources, which meant intensifying the slave trade to generate the necessary funds, which meant accelerating operations at precisely the moment when attention would be directed elsewhere. The encrypted message included specific instructions. Double the shipments to certain markets before instability disrupted established routes. Accelerate clearance of holding facilities to free capacity for increased throughput. Ensure maximum profitability during the window before Arabian buyers became unavailable. Human lives, already treated as commodities, were to be liquidated like inventory before a market crash. Baraka decoded this message during 3 nights of feverish mental work, snatching hours between duties, reconstructing the cipher structure that applied to this highest level of encryption. When he understood its full implications, he made his final decision. The opportunity had arrived. The Sultan's attention would be directed outward, toward Arabia and succession politics for months to come. The palace guard would be reduced as forces were positioned for potential deployment to Oman. The usual vigilance would be relaxed precisely when vigilance mattered most. More importantly, the intensification of operations meant more people moving through the system, more chances for confusion, more complexity to exploit, more cover for activities that might otherwise attract attention. Baraka shared the decoded information with his network, revealing for the first time the full scope of what he had discovered. The others had known he had access to sensitive information. That was why they had joined him. But none had understood the extent of his penetration into the system's communications. The revelation produced a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Fear because the knowledge made them more dangerous to the authorities, and therefore more vulnerable if discovered. Exhilaration because the knowledge also made them more powerful than they had imagined possible. The execution date was set for March 14, 1804, the new moon, when darkness would provide cover for movement, and when astrological beliefs widely held among the merchant class would keep certain officials occupied with consultations and rituals. The timing was not random. Baraka had studied the patterns of the household, identified the nights when security was relaxed, calculated the optimal conditions for each element of the plan. 6 weeks to prepare, 6 weeks to refine, 6 weeks to transform intention into action. The 5 weeks preceding that date passed with agonizing slowness. Baraka maintained his routine without variation. Each day he performed his duties with the same quiet efficiency that had made him valuable to his masters. Each night, he refined his plans, accounting for contingencies, memorizing backup routes, ensuring that his network understood their assignments without knowing enough to compromise the overall operation if any individual was captured. The planning sessions occurred in fragments, a whispered exchange while passing in a corridor, a meaningful glance that conveyed information through codes the network had developed for precisely this purpose, a message hidden in the arrangement of objects that only the initiated could read. They never gathered as a group. They never spoke openly about anything that could be overheard. They trusted each other because they had no choice, and because Baraka had selected them specifically for their capacity to endure. The division of labor was precise. The dock workers would secure a dhow, a small vessel capable of carrying 30 people, already identified and monitored for weeks. Its owner was in debt to merchants who were in conflict with the Sultan's favorite traders, making him potentially sympathetic to actions that might embarrass his creditors' allies. More importantly, The vessel was scheduled for minor repairs that would leave it accessible but not under active supervision on the night in question. The cook would ensure that certain guards consumed food containing extracts from particular plants that grew in the palace garden, not poison, which would create corpses requiring explanation, but soporifics that would make their response times fatally slow. The extracts had been gathered gradually, dried and prepared by Zubaydah using techniques she had learned from her grandmother, who had learned them from ancestors who had used such knowledge since before the arrival of Arab traders to the East African coast. Zubaydah herself, whose movements attracted no suspicion due to her apparent age and simplicity, would position tools and supplies at designated locations throughout the complex. Keys that had been copied using wax impressions made over months of careful observation. Ropes for climbing walls that were not adequately patrolled. Bundles of cloth for binding and gagging anyone who discovered the operation in progress and could not be neutralized more permanently. Baraka himself had the most dangerous assignment, accessing the document room on the second floor, where the Sultan's copies of all encoded communications were stored. These records contained information that could destroy the entire trading network: names, routes, prices, bribes, partnerships, the complete architecture of a system that depended on secrecy for its survival. In the wrong hands, such documents would be devastating. The wrong hands Baraka intended to deliver them to belonged to British naval officers operating out of Cape Town, who had been increasingly aggressive in their anti-slavery patrols. Their motives were not pure. The British Empire's sudden commitment to abolition had more to do with economic competition than moral awakening, but their effect would be real. Armed with detailed intelligence about the Zanzibar operation, the British could disrupt trade routes, intercept shipments, pressure mainland chieftains who collaborated with the Sultan. The information alone would be worth more than gold. The symbolism of how it was obtained would be worth even more. The 3 other domestic servants in the network would coordinate the extraction of enslaved persons from holding facilities within the palace complex. On any given night, between 20 and 40 people were confined in basement chambers awaiting assignment to specific buyers or transport to ships departing for various markets. March 14th would see approximately 35 people, men, women, and children, in those chambers. All would be given the choice to join the escape. The plan called for silent infiltration, rapid extraction, coordinated movement to the harbor, and departure before dawn. If everything proceeded perfectly, the dhow would be beyond pursuit range by the time the Sultan's household awakened to discover what had occurred. Nothing would proceed perfectly. Baraka knew this, but he also knew that imperfect action was better than perfect paralysis. The evening of March 13th settled over Stone Town, with the heavy stillness that precedes monsoon rains. The air tasted of salt and coming storms. The new moon had risen invisible, offering darkness so complete that a hand held at arm's length disappeared against the sky. In the palace, preparations were underway for a feast honoring a visiting dignitary from Muscat, a fortuitous coincidence that concentrated the Sultan's attention on entertainment rather than security. The kitchens had been active since dawn, producing dishes that would demonstrate wealth and sophistication to the Arabian guest. Musicians rehearsed in the courtyard. Dancers stretched in their quarters, preparing for performances that would continue into the small hours of morning. Guards who might otherwise have patrolled the perimeter were assigned to visible positions where they could add to the impression of power and stability. They stood at attention along the main corridors, in decorative formation at the entrance hall, wherever the dignitary's eye might fall. The dark corners and back passages were left to their usual minimal surveillance. Baraka served refreshments during the early reception, his face arranged in its practiced mask of deferential attention. He noted which guards drank from which vessels, tracking the distribution of the cook's special preparations. He observed the routes between the reception hall and the private quarters, confirming that his memorized map matched current arrangements. He listened to conversations that his masters assumed he could not understand. Discussions of the Omani situation, of European threats, of plans that presumed the continuation of systems he intended to destroy. The feast began at the 8th hour after sunset. By the 9th hour, the guards who had consumed the prepared food were showing signs of sluggishness. By the 10th hour, several had found quiet corners in which to rest their eyes. By the 11th hour, The route from the servants' quarters to the basement holding chambers was clear. At the appointed hour, Baraka excused himself from the reception, with a murmured reference to other duties. No one paid attention. A servant leaving a room was no more notable than a shadow shifting on a wall. The document room was locked, but Baraka had anticipated this. During months of observation, he had identified the hiding place where the head clerk kept a spare key, a small irregularity in an otherwise systematic man's behavior, born of the anxiety of misplacing something important. The key was precisely where he expected it to be, tucked into a gap between wallstones near the clerk's desk. Inside the document room, Baraka worked with controlled speed. He knew exactly which cabinets held the most valuable records. He knew that taking everything was impossible. The volume was too great, and the weight would make rapid movement impractical. He focused on files that would cause maximum damage. The encryption codebook itself, which would allow British intelligence to read captured communications. The correspondence with European intermediaries, which would expose collaborators throughout the colonial administration. The detailed financial records that implicated officials across 3 continents in a web of corruption that reached from village headmen in the Congo to ministers in London. The documents filled 2 leather satchels, heavier than he had estimated despite his careful selection. Carrying them would slow his movement through the complex. This was an acceptable risk. Without these records, the operation would be a humanitarian victory, but a strategic failure. With them, the blow could be fatal to the entire trade network. The signal came at midnight, a particular bird call that Zubeda had practiced until she could produce it flawlessly. It meant that the drugged guards had succumbed, that the basement chambers were accessible, that the extraction could begin. Baraka moved through corridors he had memorized in darkness, navigating by touch and mental map. The document satchels hung heavy across his shoulders. His breath came carefully controlled, silent despite the exertion. Every sense strained for warning sounds. Footsteps, voices, the creak of a door opening unexpectedly. He reached the basement access point without incident. One of the domestic servants waited there, face invisible in the darkness, but presence confirmed by a pattern of clicks. Another code the network had developed for communication when speech was impossible. The lock on the basement door yielded to the copied key. The door swung open on hinges that had been oiled days earlier by Zubeda, eliminating the squeak that might have betrayed the operation. Stone steps descended into deeper darkness, into air that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. The holding chamber held 33 people that night. Men, women, and children, ranging in age from approximately 5 years to perhaps 60. All awaiting transport to various destinations where their labor or their bodies would generate profit for men who had never learned their names. They sat in darkness, chained to wall rings, forbidden to speak above whispers. Baraka's appearance among them produced first fear, then confusion, then something he had not anticipated. Hope. He had prepared explanations, rehearsed phrases designed to convey essential information quickly and quietly, to establish trust that could not be earned through longer exposure. He found that explanations were unnecessary. The captives understood immediately what was happening. Some wept silently. Others began preparing themselves for movement with efficiency, born of having nothing to lose. The chains were not complicated. Mass-produced manacles designed for economy rather than security. The network had obtained keys weeks earlier, copied from a set carelessly left unattended during a routine inspection. Within 15 minutes, all 33 people were free of their restraints, organized into the departure groups that Baraka had planned, ready to move. What happened over the next 4 hours would later be reconstructed from multiple sources. Testimony extracted under torture from captured participants, reports filed by palace officials attempting to explain their failures, accounts passed through generations of oral tradition that reached European ethnographers decades afterward. The details sometimes conflict, but the outline remains consistent. The extraction proceeded through the palace complex with coordination that suggested far more than 8 participants. The freed captives moved in 5 groups, each led by a member of Baraka's network, following routes carefully selected to avoid the areas where conscious guards remained on duty. The dock workers had secured the dhow and prepared it for immediate departure. The loading took place in complete darkness, human shapes passing from dock to vessel in silence, broken only by the soft lap of water against hulls. Then everything went wrong. A guard who had not consumed the prepared food, substituted for another at the last minute due to a minor illness, discovered the empty holding chamber at approximately the 3rd hour of morning. His shout of alarm echoed through the palace, cutting through the lingering sounds of the feast that had finally ended, bringing running footsteps and then more shouts as the scale of the breach became apparent. Baraka heard the alarm from the dock. The dhow was loaded, the captives secured below deck, but the vessel had not yet cast off. There was perhaps a minute of decision before pursuit would organize and reach the harbor. The dhow's owner, who had been persuaded to cooperate through a combination of debt pressure and idealistic appeal, made his choice. He ordered the mooring ropes cut and the oars deployed. The vessel began moving away from the dock as the first torches appeared on the harbor wall. Baraka did not board with the others. He had always known that his escape was the least likely element of the plan. He was too valuable to the operation's success to risk on the most dangerous part of the extraction. The documents he carried needed to reach British hands. If he were captured, everything he had stolen would be recovered, and the network's sacrifice would be for nothing. He had arranged an alternative extraction route, a smaller vessel, hidden in a cove 3 miles down the coast, where a fisherman who owed Zubida his life waited to carry a passenger to a British patrol ship known to operate in those waters. The route required crossing terrain held by forces loyal to the Sultan, avoiding patrols that would certainly be deployed once the alarm spread, and reaching the cove before dawn made travel impossible. The satchels of documents weighed against his shoulders as he ran. The darkness that had protected the extraction now complicated his navigation. His mental map of Stonetown's streets served him well, but beyond the city's edge, the terrain became less familiar. He moved by instinct, by the sound of the ocean on his left, by the stars that appeared briefly through gaps in the gathering clouds. Behind him, Stonetown erupted in activity. Torches multiplied on the palace walls. Shouts carried across the water, directing pursuit boats toward the fleeing dhow. Baraka paused on a rise overlooking the harbor long enough to see the vessel's silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the sea. It was moving slowly but steadily, oars dipping in unison, carrying 33 people toward uncertain freedom. The dhow had perhaps an hour's head start before faster pursuit vessels could be launched. It was not enough time. The craft would be overtaken before reaching any refuge, unless something changed the calculation. Baraka made his decision in the space of a breath. He had planned for this contingency, though he had hoped it would not be necessary. The documents he carried would still reach British hands. He had arranged for that, created redundancies, ensured that his own capture or death would not negate everything the network had built. But the freed captives on that dhow had no redundancy. Their only chance was the one they were taking right now. He reversed his course, moving not away from Stonetown, but back toward it. Not toward the harbor, where pursuit was concentrating, but toward the warehouse district, where a particular building held particular materials that could change everything. The warehouse belonged to a merchant who traded in multiple commodities, including the sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter that comprised gunpowder. Security was minimal. The goods were valuable but not exceptionally so, and the district was generally peaceful. The lock yielded to methods Baraka had learned from one of the dock workers, who had spent years observing how things could be opened by those not meant to open them. Inside, the air was thick with chemical smell. Baraka moved by touch, locating the materials he needed, combining them in proportions he had learned from documents discussing military logistics. The mixture was crude, far from the refined powder used in weapons, but it would burn. More importantly, it would burn spectacularly, creating the kind of distraction that might pull pursuit vessels back to shore. He set the fire near the warehouse entrance, ensuring it would spread to the stored materials gradually, rather than immediately. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the explosion, 15 at most, time to clear the area, to resume his original route, to hope that the distraction achieved what it needed to achieve. The explosion exceeded his expectations. The warehouse did not merely burn, it detonated, sending a pillar of flame into the night sky visible from miles away, shattering windows throughout the district, collapsing adjacent structures. The fire spread to neighboring buildings, creating a conflagration that demanded immediate response from everyone capable of fighting it. On the harbor wall, the torches that had been directing pursuit vessels turned toward the new threat. On the water, Boats that had been preparing to chase the dhow reversed course to address the emergency threatening the commercial heart of Stone Town. The dhow, now invisible in the darkness beyond the harbor lights, continued its escape while the city burned. Baraka watched from a distance as the fire consumed the warehouse district. He felt neither triumph nor regret. The destruction was necessary, a tactical decision, not a moral statement. The people in those buildings were not his enemies, but they were also not his responsibility. His responsibility was on that dhow, pulling away from everything he had known, carrying 33 people toward the possibility of freedom. He turned away from the fire and resumed his route toward the cove. Behind him, Stone Town burned. Ahead of him, the night waited with whatever it held. Dawn found Baraka 3 miles down the coast, at the edge of a cove where a small fishing boat bobbed gently in water turned golden by the rising sun. The fisherman who waited there, an elderly man named Mwamba, who had survived a fever 10 years earlier because Zubaydah had brought him herbs when his own people had abandoned him to die, asked no questions when the exhausted young man emerged from the scrubland, carrying leather satchels too heavy for their apparent size. The crossing to the British patrol route took 6 hours. The patrol vessel that intercepted them, HMS Sparrow, under the command of Lieutenant James Howell, was initially suspicious of a local fishing boat hailing them with urgent signals. Howell's suspicion transformed to astonishment when the young African passenger produced documents written in Arabic script and, in flawless English learned from overheard conversations in the palace, explained what they contained. The British had been attempting to intercept Zanzibar slave shipments for years with limited success. The trade's operators knew the patrol schedules, avoided known interception points, maintained communication security that had frustrated every intelligence-gathering effort. Now, a teenage boy was handing them the complete operational manual of their adversary's network. Howell was not certain whether to believe what he was hearing. The documents appeared authentic, but the story accompanying them seemed impossible. A palace slave who had decoded top-secret communications? A coordinated escape operation executed under the Sultan's nose? A warehouse explosion that had apparently destroyed a significant portion of Stone Town's commercial district? He decided to bring the boy and his documents to Cape Town, where superior officers could make determinations above his authority. Baraka was given quarters aboard the Sparrow, not as a prisoner, but not quite as a guest either. His status would remain undefined until the value of his intelligence could be assessed. The assessment took 2 weeks. British codebreakers in Cape Town confirmed that the cipher documents were genuine and that they allowed previously intercepted messages to be read for the first time. Intelligence officers compiled lists of collaborators, traced routes, identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The information was, as one report stated with characteristic British understatement, of considerable strategic value. Baraka became briefly famous in colonial administrative circles. A curiosity passed between offices, questioned repeatedly about details of the Zanzibar operation, asked to verify interpretations of decoded communications. He answered what he could, withheld what he judged might be used against his own people rather than their oppressors, and waited to learn what would become of the 33 people he had helped escape. The news, when it came, was mixed. The dhow had been intercepted by a British patrol vessel 2 days out of Zanzibar, but intercepted in a different sense than the Sultan's forces had intended. The patrol captain, informed by signals from the Sparrow that the vessel was carrying escaped captives rather than cargo, had provided escort rather than pursuit. The dhow had reached the Seychelles, where the passengers were given provisional status as freed persons under British protection. Provisional status was not freedom. It meant labor contracts, resettlement programs, lives defined by colonial administration rather than self-determination. But it was better than the alternative. It was survival with possibility, rather than the foreclosed futures that awaited those swallowed by the trade. Of the 33 people Baraka had helped extract from the palace holding chambers, 28 were still alive 3 years later. Some had found work in the Seychelles. Others had eventually returned to mainland Africa, settling in territories beyond the Sultan's reach. A few had died from diseases that the crossing had not caused, but had weakened them enough to succumb to. None had returned to slavery. Baraka learned these numbers piece by piece over the following years, tracking the scattered individuals through whatever channels he could access. He recorded them in his memory, with the same precision he had applied to the Sultan's codes, creating a mental ledger of lives saved that could be set against the ledger of atrocities he could never erase. The immediate aftermath of the escape convulsed the Zanzibar slave trade in ways that exceeded even Baraka's most optimistic projections. The documents he had stolen allowed British forces to intercept shipments with unprecedented accuracy, targeting specific routes at specific times based on intelligence that could only have come from inside the network. Within 6 months, trade volume through Zanzibar dropped by nearly 40%. The Sultan launched investigations that consumed his administration for months. The palace household was purged repeatedly, each wave of interrogations producing confessions, some accurate, most extracted through torture, and therefore reflecting what interrogators wanted to hear, rather than what had actually occurred. The encryption system was abandoned and replaced with a simpler code that took British intelligence only weeks to break. Reports filed by British colonial administrators describe the effects in clinical terms. The Zanzibar operation has been significantly disrupted, one dispatch noted, with attendant implications for regional labor markets and commercial arrangements dependent upon the trade's continuation. What the reports did not capture was the human dimension of the disruption. The raids that did not occur because the routes were compromised, the families that remained together because the ships could not run their usual schedules, the villages that were spared because the economic calculations no longer justified the military effort required to reach them. This was Baraka's legacy in its most direct form: absence. The horrors that did not happen, the lives that continued when they might have been interrupted, the futures that remained possible when the trade's continuation would have foreclosed them. But there was another legacy, less direct but perhaps more significant in the long term. Word of what had happened spread through the networks that connected enslaved populations across the Indian Ocean world. The story grew with each telling, accumulating details that may or may not have been accurate, but that captured something true about its meaning. A boy had learned his master's secrets. A boy had turned their own systems against them. A boy had proven that the power that seemed absolute was actually fragile, dependent on assumptions that could be shattered by those with courage and intelligence enough to shatter them. The story became a template. In the years following the Zanzibar escape, similar incidents occurred at trading posts from Mozambique to Madagascar, from Mombasa to the Persian Gulf. Small-scale resistances, information leaks, coordinated escapes, each bearing traces of influence from the tale of the boy who had decoded the Sultan's codes. British abolitionists, seeking narratives that would support their political campaigns, latched onto Baraka's story as evidence of African agency and capability that contradicted the racist assumptions underlying defenses of slavery. His intelligence, his planning, his execution of a complex operation under impossible conditions, all of this demonstrated capacities that the trade's defenders claimed did not exist in their victims. The abolitionists' use of the story was not without problems. They simplified it, sanitized it, transformed Baraka into a symbol rather than a person. They emphasized his learning of European languages and his cooperation with British forces, while downplaying the violence of the warehouse explosion and the moral complexities of his choices. They made him palatable to audiences that wanted heroes without complications. But even distorted, the story did work that mattered. It contributed to the gradually shifting opinion that would eventually produce legal abolition throughout the British Empire. It provided ammunition for arguments that the trade was not only immoral, but unstable, dependent on the continued passivity of people who had demonstrated their capacity for resistance. The Baraka method, as it came to be called in administrative documents, referred to any intelligence-based resistance by enslaved persons, the use of literacy, observation, and systematic planning to undermine operations from within. It became a category of threat that required countermeasures: limits on education, restrictions on movement, increased surveillance of those who displayed unusual cognitive capabilities. These countermeasures were themselves evidence of the method's effectiveness. If it posed no real threat, it would not have required such systematic response. The fact that trade operators across the Indian Ocean world modified their procedures specifically to prevent another Baraka-style operation testified to the original operation's impact. What became of Baraka himself is less certain than what became of his legacy. The historical record grows sparse after his arrival in Cape Town. British documents mention him intermittently over the following years: requests for his assistance in intelligence matters, administrative correspondence about his status and location, but the mentions become less frequent and eventually cease entirely. Some accounts suggest that he settled in the Cape Colony, living under a new name, working as a translator and scribe for traders who never knew his history. Other accounts place him in Britain itself, brought there by abolitionists who wanted to display him to sympathetic audiences as proof of African intellectual equality. Still other accounts insist that he eventually returned to East Africa, settling in territories beyond the Sultan's reach, helping others escape through methods he had developed and refined. The oral traditions that preserved his story in the decades after his escape offer multiple endings, none confirmed by documentary evidence. In one version, he died an old man, surrounded by descendants who carried his memory into subsequent generations. In another, he was killed by agents of the Sultan who never forgave the humiliation he had inflicted. In a third, he simply disappeared, walking into the interior of Africa and never emerging again, choosing oblivion over the complications of continued existence in a world that could not quite accommodate what he had become. Perhaps all of these endings are true in some sense. Perhaps none of them are. The historical Baraka, the specific individual who was born near Lake Tanganyika, who endured the march to the coast, who was sold in Stone Town, who learned languages and codes and patience, who planned and executed and escaped. That person existed and mattered. But he also became something larger than himself, a story that could be told in multiple ways to serve multiple purposes, a symbol whose meaning exceeded any particular factual account. What is certain is that his name persisted. Baraka, blessing, continued to be given to children throughout East Africa in the generations that followed, carrying associations of intelligence, resistance, and transformation that no dictionary definition could fully capture. The name became itself a kind of code, a signal among those who remembered what codes could accomplish. The physical traces of Baraka's operation have mostly disappeared from Stone Town. The palace that housed the Sultan's administration was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the following 2 centuries, victim of fires, political changes, and the gradual transformation of the area into the tourist destination it has become. The warehouse district that Baraka ignited never fully recovered, its location eventually absorbed into the expanding urban development that replaced colonial commercial structures with more modern forms. A pattern in the coral stonework of a building near the former palace site resembles the cipher symbols that Baraka learned to read, though whether this is coincidence or deliberate memorial is debated. The descendants of the 33 people who escaped that night in 1804 are scattered across continents now, most unaware of the specific circumstances that determined their ancestors' survival. But certain traces remain for those who know how to read them. An inscription in Arabic on a wall near the old harbor, barely visible beneath layers of paint and weather damage, records a prayer for travelers that some scholars believe was placed there by members of the escape party before they departed. But the survival itself propagated through generations, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each carrying forward the genetic inheritance of those who might have died in the trade's machinery but did not. This is perhaps the most profound legacy, not the documents or the disrupted routes or the political changes, but the simple existence of human beings who would not exist if the escape had failed. Lives that have produced additional lives, in branching multiplicities that extend beyond any possible counting. Every calculation of impact must eventually confront this exponential dimension. The 33 people Baraka helped escape would, over 200 years, become thousands of descendants whose existence depended on that single night's success. The trade itself would have destroyed not just individual lives but entire potential futures. Family lines terminated, contributions never made, children never born. What Baraka preserved was not just 33 people, but everything they would produce and everyone they would become. The mathematics of survival extends beyond any ledger's capacity to record. If you have watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our world forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth. The question that remains is what we do with such stories once we know them. Baraka's tale offers no simple morals, no comfortable conclusions. He was both a victim and an agent, both a product of the system that oppressed him and an architect of its disruption. He used violence strategically and lived with the consequences of that violence. He saved lives he never knew, and failed to save others he had known intimately. He was exceptional in ways that illuminated the capabilities latent in everyone the trade defined as subhuman. His story challenges us to see intelligence and capacity where systems of oppression insist on seeing only useful bodies. It challenges us to recognize that resistance takes forms invisible to those not watching for it. It challenges us to acknowledge that the powerless often have more power than their oppressors imagine, and that this unacknowledged power can, under the right circumstances, remake worlds. The ruins of the old palace still stand in Stone Town. The call to prayer still echoes through streets that once witnessed the daily commerce of human beings sold like commodities. The Indian Ocean still carries dhows on routes not so different from those sailed in 1804. And somewhere in that matrix of persistence and change, the memory of Baraka remains, blessing, burden, and testament to what becomes possible when those who are supposed to be invisible decide to be seen. Like this video, if the story of Baraka touched your heart, share it so that his memory will never be forgotten.